Des yeux qui font baisser les miens, un rire qui se perd sur sa bouche, voilà le portrait sans retouche de l'homme auquel j'appartiens. Quand il me prend dans ses bras, qu'il me parle tout bas, je vois la vie en rose. Il me dit des mots d'amour, des mots de tous les jours, et ça me fait quelque chose. Il est entré dans mon cœur une part de bonheur dont je connais.
We're at the home of Reme Charmoz today to honor the life of his extraordinary father, Jacques Charmoz, as a Life-Flix tribute video. Reme, thanks so very much for having us here at your beautiful home on this beautiful day, the 24th of June, 2015. Before we jump right into your father, why don't you give us a short background about your life, where you were born and your family and that type of thing.
Sure, I'll be glad to. First, thank you very much to you, Scott, and to Life-Flix for the opportunity to share the story of our father, who had an extraordinary life, who was a bit of a musketeer, and both my brother and sister and I are very grateful for this opportunity. As far as I'm concerned, I'm the product of course, my mother and father. My mother being an American, I do have dual roots, and therefore spent my life both in Europe and in the United States. The first part of my life was spent in Europe with my father and mother. Following their divorce, my mother came back to the United States, and following my studies in France, I was at the Sorbonne when the major pastime was throwing rocks at the police in 1968. Decided I wasn't going to get much of an education, so I decided to come to the US and see if I could continue my education here. So I moved to Washington, D.C., went to George Washington University, got a master's degree, ended up with a mortgage, 2.5 kids, a dog, and a station wagon, and here I was, rooted.
You left France in what year to come here?
This was 1967.
67.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So you're leaving a family in France then who are with us today?
Yes, actually my brother lives in Paris, my sister lives in Paris, and my mother, who is now 91 years old, and is the American, the true American of the family, also lives in Paris. She actually prefers Paris to the United States. So
that's great.
Yes.
Well, thank you. So walk us back a little bit. I know your father had all kinds of wonderful opportunities and talents and things in his life. So why don't you start at the beginning and tell us when he was born and where he lived and what events in his life led to all these extraordinary things.
Jacques-Henri Guy Charmoz was his name. Charmoz spelled with a T, and I'll get to why it was changed in a little while. The family was from the region of Savoy, which is in the Alps, on the other side of the Italian part of the Alps. It was actually annexed by France in the 1860s, so it's likely that a lot of my family actually has Italian roots rather than French roots. But my father was born in Paris from a middle-class bourgeois family in Paris. He had a younger sister, and he very early on proved to be a very independent-minded and adventurous young man. He went to the École des Beaux-Arts, which is the French art school, if you will, that is the most prized and known in Paris, and studied fine arts, a profession which he really didn't get to use until after the war. So this was in probably the late 20s when this was happening. At the time, he was also involved in a new ski club, which was called the SCAP, the Ski Club Alpin Parisien, which is the French alpine skiing from Paris. And that club used to travel to the Alps as often as they could. They were all avid skiers and mountaineers, and they were really truly pioneers because there were really no lifts or anything. They would kind of hang on to the bumpers of cars to get up to the mountains, and then they would have to climb up and ski down. And of course, they would also do some mountaineering while they were there. But he became quite a good skier, quite a good mountaineer, and earned his diploma as a French ski instructor while he was doing this. And eventually participated not only in the University Olympics as a skier, but later in 1936 in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, he participated in the Winter Olympics skiing for France.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So, yes, so he was quite accomplished.
At that time, did they have the slalom or the giant slalom? What was his specialty?
I believe at that time it was, as far as alpine skiing was concerned, it was giant slalom and downhill. The slalom, I believe, came later because it required fixed boot skiing, and I'm not quite sure that had already been established by that time. So it was mostly trying to go as fast as you could down the mountain.
Well, that's wonderful to be a member of the French Olympic team in 1936. Amazing.
Yes.
Was he able to continue to ski much in his life?
Well, interesting enough, based on that, he and one of his co-members of the Olympic team, a man by the name of Daniel de Wulf, were hired by the Chilean army in Chile to teach the Chilean troops how to ski and defend the 4,000 kilometers of borders that they have with the Andes between Brazil and Paraguay and Argentina and what have you, along the same lines as the famous French chasseurs alpine troops that defended France against any potential attacks from not Switzerland but Italy or whomever might want to be coming through that way. They used to wear all white uniforms and ski, etc., etc. So the Chileans were quite interested in that type of formation for their troops, and they hired my father and de Wulf to come and train their troops.
But a pioneering effort, only made famous, to folks like us in the James Bond movies of racing down the mountains and mountaineering white uniforms.
Yes, indeed. So when they arrived in Chile, they went to Barranquillo, which is a little ski resort. It wasn't really, kind of a ski resort outside of Santiago. And the troops were there, and they were supposed to train them and teach them how to ski and how to carry a gun and a rifle and hide between rocks, and I don't know what else they were doing. But they were experiencing quite a bit of difficulties training the troops because they did not speak Spanish, and because since they were not uniformed, the troops were not really keen on obeying their orders. So the staff, the chief of staff over there in Chile, solved the problem by making them both full colonels in the Chilean army. So at the tender age of 26, my father was a full colonel in a foreign army in Chile, wearing his badges and uniform, and would order people to do push-ups and bend their knees, or else they would have be subjected to military discipline. It was kind of an interesting twist.
Wow,
yes.
Tremendous.
Yes.
Did he continue in the armed forces for Chile, or did he make his way
He was
back
there
to
for a
that?
couple of years, and then he taught himself how to fly also over there on his own. I don't know if he got his license there or in the U.S. subsequently, but that's where he started flying. So he made his way back to the U.S., and he was there in 1939 when the war broke out in Europe.
I see.
Of course, he could not go back to France, and he was assigned by the French embassy to help the sailors who were at sea when the armistice was signed. So these ships, of course, did not surrender. They made their way to the U.S. and were in safe haven there, but they had to be recommissioned or put into different forces or what have you. Kind of a desk job that he did not enjoy. So he made his way to Canada, and after having completed his pilot's license, and applied and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. And he was very soon reassigned to the Royal Air Force in something known as the Ferry Command. And the Ferry Command was a group of pilots who were charged under the Lend-Lease program to ferry all the bombers that were being manufactured in Canada and in the USA to the European front.
I see.
So this was in the early 40s, and when you think back that Lindbergh had crossed the Atlantic for the first time 13 years earlier, it was quite a feat to fly bombers across the Atlantic on a regular basis, especially considering that they couldn't fly above 10,000 feet because they didn't have any pressurized cabins or oxygen, that they had to fly over the Arctic Circle, so they were subject to icing of the wings, icing of the carburetors. There was no heat in the cabins. They were covered from head to toe with leather suits and lamb and all kinds of protection to prevent them from freezing to death. And they would stop in Newfoundland and Iceland and to refuel and eventually make it to Ireland and the UK.
I see. So from a military perspective, it wasn't dangerous. The Germans weren't shooting at these transports, or were they?
No, they really didn't have any real access to these routes.
Right.
It was, I would say it was an easy job because it was a very perilous job. They lost a lot of people. But they also did that on the Pacific front, where they would fly over the Pacific and bring planes to the now U.S.-Japanese front after 1941. Yes.
A very important career opportunity for him. You mentioned earlier that he was recognized by some very important people for this effort.
Yes, that's quite true. Interestingly enough, when a book was written about the Ferry Command called Bombers Across, I forget the author and I regret that, Major Wynne, I believe, there is a preface in there from Lowell Thomas, who is a very famous radio broadcaster during the war times. And in his preface to this book, there are probably 4 pages devoted to my father, where he calls him the Blue Devil, which was the name that they gave to the skiers in those days of the Chasseurs Alpins. And interestingly enough, he had met Lowell Thomas just prior to the war, because in between his trying to get enlisted, he had gone from Chile and ended up in Stowe, Vermont, where he met Zepp Rushp and some of the other pioneers of Stowe. And there's actually a book called The Pioneers of Stowe, which was recently published, where there are a few pages devoted to my father as well. So he was one of the first ski instructors there with Zepp Rushp, and they were the ones who started in some way the fame of the resort. This was way before the Von Trapp family actually put Stowe on the map, which happened after the war.
So after the war, the war was over, and where was he at this point?
So after the war, during the war, actually, he met with Charles de Gaulle and became part of the Free French forces. And as an aside, when I first started, I talked about his name, Charmoz. And it appears, we don't know the exact story, but it appears that during the war, he changed his name to Charmoz with a Z, to avoid reprisals against his family, which had remained in Paris. Of course, Paris was occupied by the Nazis, and the Nazis had a habit of letting it known to resistance fighters or people who were in Free French forces or other forces that their families were in jeopardy unless they surrendered. So a lot of people changed their names, and my father did that.
And his original name ended in a T?
Correct.
And he changed it to a Z?
He changed it to a Z.
I see.
Which kind of reflected his love for the mountaineering side of him, which took him back to the Chamonix area, the Mont Blanc. And if you look to the left of the Mont Blanc, there are two peaks called the Little Charmoz and the Big Charmoz. And I'm sure he had climbed those, and probably in his heart he had always wanted to be known as Charmoz, so he became Charmoz. And that became not only his nom de plume that he used for his art, but also his legal name.
Yeah. Excellent. So after the war, he
is back in France now, and he is at that time joining a small airline called Aigle Azur. He himself had purchased a couple of airplanes from American surplus material, and he had also purchased 5 cargo ships from the U.S., including a PT boat.
PT boats?
A PT boat, yes.
Were on sale.
Those were on sale at the time. So during the early 50s, actually, well, first off, he had gotten married in 1946, shortly after he started working with Air France. And he was actually the one who inaugurated the Paris-New York route for Air France. As a pilot on a DC-4. And so in the 40s, he spent, early mid-40s, he spent a lot of time in the U.S. His roots would take him to Los Angeles as well, where he met a lot of people. Los Angeles was already becoming the mini Hollywood, and of course he met with a lot of these people. He met some stars and starlets, and one of them happened to be my mother, who was a supermodel, and also a starlet in maybe not Hollywood, but Los Angeles anyway. They got married.
What was her name?
Her name was Barbara Overton Mosby. And she is a descendant of the Mosby clan, which includes John Singleton Mosby, who was known as the Gray Ghost during the Civil War. And she is a daughter of the American Republic, or Revolution, I'm sorry, the daughter of the American Revolution. So is my daughter now, because obviously we passed on that through the lineage. So we are DAR, even though we have a French name.
Nice.
Yes.
Wonderful.
So he had 3 children, including myself. I'm the middle one. I have a younger sister. We were born on the Riviera in the late 1940s, and that was the time when he was actually smuggling cigarettes between Tangier and the Italian coast.
On the boats and planes that he owned?
On the boats and planes that he had purchased from American surplus. So that lasted until he got caught. And even though he was never implicated, if you will, all the ships were seized and all the merchandise was seized, and I guess he had to make some changes to his profession. So he went back to flying. And what he did is he enlisted with Aigle Azur, who was providing air support to the French troops in Indochina. A lot of Americans don't know that before we got involved in what became Vietnam, it was known as Indochina. It was a French colony, and it was quite a bit of a long war between the French and Indochina. And just like our fellow Americans, the French were defeated by the Vietnamese or the Indochinese. And my father happened to be the last one there to evacuate the generals after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. He was actually stationed in Hanoi, and when Dien Bien Phu fell, then the generals went on his plane and they were evacuated out of Indochina. So after that was completed, he came back to Paris, and now a lot of his musketeering ways, if you will, were pretty much behind him, so he started focusing on his family. And that's when I guess that's when we probably saw the most of him. You know, we had a very interesting life as we were growing up, because as an independent artist, he didn't have 9 to 5 hours. He did not have an office. What he had was a love of the sea and a love of the mountains.
So he studied art, and now after those days are over, he's back in Paris. This year is, where are we talking about?
We're talking mid-50s now.
Mid-50s.
Mid-50s. He's going back into commercial arts. Yeah.
Okay. You were a young boy at this time.
I was 6 years old. My sister was 4. My brother was 8.
I
So
see.
we were quite young.
So he's now taking up his commercial art training.
Right. We're in Paris, and but we're only in Paris during certain seasons, because come October, November, the whole family gets packed up, and we go to Switzerland, and we spend the winter either in Klosters or in St-Moritz. Some of the finest resorts that you can imagine. Klosters was a very interesting town, where we practically grew up in a way. We even went to schools there, learning Schweizerdeutsch and what have you. But our friends were pillars of industry from all over Europe. Most of us were from different countries. We developed our own language where it didn't matter what word we used. It was a kind of a garbling mixture of English, French, Spanish, Italian, you name it. But we all understood one another. And we stayed there and really skied for 4 or 5 months until we all went back to our respective countries. And then the summer would come, and when the summer came, then we would pack up from Paris again and go down to the Riviera. And we would spend 3 months in Cannes and Saint-Tropez, and again on one of those boats that he had purchased from the American surplus. This one happened to be a 50-foot Chris Craft. So that's where we spent our vacations.
Not a luxury Chris Craft, a military Chris Craft.
It was a military Chris Craft, yes.
But I'm sure he...
It was quite livable. It was quite livable, yes. I have to make a parenthesis here in saying that my father, in spite of all the things that he did and achieved, was never a rich man.
Oh.
And even though we constantly lived a life of royalty in places of royalty, we just happened to be there, but we didn't need much to be there. It's just that we were there, and it was just a very interesting upbringing, because obviously we became very accustomed to the lives of our friends, who had just so much to offer in terms of their own education and culture, and the fact that we became their friends and were able to spend some time with them and visit with them and vacation with them as well. So.
Well, it certainly sounds rich in spirit and rich in experience.
Yes, it certainly was.
So he's become a well-known artist at this point.
Yes.
Maybe in the 70s, and is he making a living at his
Yes,
artwork?
he is. He actually first he started with some commercial work where he did drawing for primarily ad agencies for very famous French brands like Marie Brizard and Evian Perrier and Lustre and Scandale, and did some very, very interesting, very creative work. The drawing and developing of very large posters was a very big thing in France. All of the subways in Paris are plastered with posters that are, I don't know what the dimensions are, probably 25 feet by 25 feet. And every subway station has probably 40 of them on each side of the station. And then, of course, all the buses were plastered with very long posters covering the entire bus. And then there were billboards and what have you. So posters were a very important form of advertising. Of course, in those days, you have to realize radio and television were nascent. Radio couldn't do anything for you as far as graphics is concerned. And television was, black and white. There wasn't much advertising. France never liked advertising on television became nationalized very quickly. People would just pay a due and there was no advertising. So it was mostly posters and magazine advertising. So he got into magazines as well. And then his next step was to go into political cartoons. And he became a very famous political cartoonist in France. So he had an ability to draw and make caricatures of French leaders that were exceptional. And so he actually had a weekly page in Paris Match, which is probably the best known French publication outside of France. It's a very, not exclusive, but very well known, very popular magazine. And he had a page in there for years and years and years, including doing covers for them. And then his more risque cartoons he would send to magazines that were more focused on politics, if you will, so they wouldn't offend anybody. But he had some pretty interesting risque cartoons as well that were published in Ghana, Enchaîné, and Candide, and other such places.
That's an amazing life, and something now we understand why you wanted to do this today. Bring us to the conclusion now, and as his life, came to a conclusion, where were you, and what were those circumstances?
In the late 60s, well, actually in the early 60s, my parents were divorced. In the late 60s, my mother came back to the United States, and in the late 60s, I also came to join her in the United States. So I did spend some time with my father until then, but the last 10 years of his life we would see one another perhaps when I would come to France or when he would come to the US. My brother and sister stayed there, so they saw much more of him. He actually started living in Switzerland, in Gstaad, which is another resort town, and started painting oils and acrylics. And that was, it was a very interesting combination of art. He had gone to Haiti to learn about the naive art form, which is kind of one-dimensional, if you will, or two-dimensional, very flat type paintings, not a lot of 3D effects. And when he combined that with his cartooning and illustrating talents, it made for some very interesting artwork. And what he did was starting to paint Swiss landscapes in a naive, illustrative format. And I'm sure that we will be able to show you some of this art that he created that way. It was quite acclaimed. He had expositions in Switzerland, in France, even in the USA. And was starting to make a name for himself now in that particular field, when in 1981 he came back from a ski trip, complaining of back pains. It turned out that it was an arterial dissection that he was suffering from. And my cousin, his nephew, who's a heart surgeon, operated on him immediately, but his heart gave out and he passed away in 1981. Yes, but not after he had had the opportunity to come and to the U.S. and see me get married and see my brother get married. So he knew we were taken care of and happy. So he miss him.
So Reme, what an amazing life. Thanks so much for sharing this story with us. It's obvious to me that a lot of your father's talents have been translated into your life as a creative marketing executive and a creative person and an artist yourself. So thank you very much. We really appreciate the chance to make this story and make it a tribute to your father.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Life-Flix, for this opportunity to tell our father's story. I wish I had an ounce of his talent, but I do appreciate you saying that some of it has passed along. My brother and sister and I have always wanted to have some sort of tribute to him. We feel that it would be a waste to have his life not recognized somewhere, or not at least compiled and stored somewhere for others to see and share. So it's certainly been an opportunity that we cherish and we very much appreciate it. Thank you.